In the middle of a snowstorm, a young woman found an unconscious man. No name, no past, just silence. She helped him without asking why. But that day, she unknowingly changed her own fate. Because some encounters are never just coincidence. The wind was howling like an animal on the side of the mountain, whipping the snow through the air and slapping it against faces. The sky had already darkened. The clouds were pressing down with a leaden weight, and it felt like even the mountain was quietly pulling inward. Emma, walking with a half-filled wood basket on her back, could feel her boots filling with more water with every step. Her nose and fingertips had gone numb, but she wanted to get home before the darkness took over. As she rounded the hill, she suddenly noticed a dark shape in the corner of her eye. At first, she thought it was a trick of the light, but when she turned to look again, she saw a body half buried in the snow. Her heart squeezed. She rushed over, crouched down. The man's face was covered in snow, but right beside his head, a frozen patch of blood caught her attention. Emma, with trembling hands, felt for his shoulder. "Hey, can you hear me?" The man didn't respond. She checked his pulse. It was slow, but he was alive. She quickly cleared the snow from his face. He was a stranger, not someone from the village. He wore a coat, but it was open at the front, and his shirt was wet. He'd clearly been caught off guard by the storm. There was no phone beside him. Emma hesitated for a moment. If she left him there, he wouldn't survive the night in this cold. But she couldn't carry him. She held her breath, then knelt down on the snow-covered path, gripping the man's arms and starting to pull him. Her feet sank into the snow, and her knees ached. Every now and then, the wind howled so fiercely she forgot about the wood on her back. The 20-minute distance felt like a lifetime that night. But when Emma finally reached her door, her legs could carry her no longer. With one last effort, she pushed the door open and stepped inside. Silence reigned between the cold stone walls. She moved toward the stove, laying the man down on the floor before quickly starting a fire. Her numb fingers made it difficult to hold the match, but she didn't give up. Sparks flew, and dry twigs crackled. The flames slowly began to fill the room with light. Next, she rushed to the bedroom, found some old blankets, and covered the man. She checked the wound on his head. The bleeding seemed to have stopped, but he was still unconscious. She stroked his cold face, trying to dry his forehead. His lips had turned almost purple. Emma pulled an old phone from a small bag by the stove. With a shaky voice, she dialed a number. "Hello? Emergency help. I found a man up on the mountain road. He's unconscious. He's got a head injury. Yes, he's breathing, but very weak. Please hurry." When she hung up the phone, she felt a little relief. But it would be at least an hour before they arrived. All Emma could do was keep him warm and wait by his side until he regained consciousness. She stayed by his side all night. She heated water, made soup, but his eyes remained closed. Every time he took a breath, she listened closely, and when his breathing slowed, panic set in. She couldn't sleep. For a moment, she realized her eyes were welling up. "I don't know who you are, but I won't let you die. You have to wake up, please." Hours passed. While the flames danced in the stove, the storm outside raged on. When Emma's tired eyes settled on the man's face, she suddenly saw his lips move. She leaned in quickly. "Water, please." Emma grabbed the cup warming on the stove and brought it to his lips. He took a few weak sips. His eyes cracked open just a little before closing again. But now Emma knew. He was alive. And by morning, the rescue team would come to take him away. What she didn't know yet was that the man she had found in the snowstorm that night wouldn't just change one life. He would change hers entirely. Morning arrived with a gray silence. The storm had subsided outside, but the snow on the roads had completely blocked the village paths. The sky had brightened, but the rescue team still hadn't arrived. Emma hadn't slept all night and had stayed by the man's side. From time to time, she rushed to the window, hoping to hear the sound of an engine, but all she could hear was the quiet fall of snowflakes. When the phone rang again, she picked it up immediately. "Hello? Ma'am, we're very sorry. The storm blocked the roads completely last night. The team is about to leave, but even with chains, their vehicles are moving slowly. It will take at least 3 hours." Emma took a deep breath. Her eyes went back to the man lying on the floor. She answered in a shaky voice. Okay, we'll wait." After hanging up, the first thought that crossed her mind was, if this man hadn't made it through the night, an ambulance wouldn't matter anymore. But thank God, he was still alive. As the first light of the second morning filtered through the walls of the house, Emma noticed that the man, wrapped in old blankets, had shifted slightly. His face was still pale, but his lips were moving. His eyelids slowly opened. Emma immediately went to his side. "Are you waking up?" The man squinted, then spoke in a hoarse voice. "Where am I?" "You're safe. I found you by the mountain road. You hit your head in the snowstorm. You were about to freeze." The man looked around, scanning the cracks in the ceiling, the flame in the stove, the old wooden chairs. Then his eyes met Emma's. "What's your name?" "Emma. This is our home. I live here with my mom. She's inside. She's a little sick." The man turned his head with a groan of pain and then whispered with difficulty, "My name is Daniel." Emma hesitated for a moment. "Your last name?" Daniel shook his head slowly, a faint smile on his lips. "For now, just Daniel. It's easier that way." This answer surprised Emma, but she didn't press him. There was a weariness in his eyes, not physical, but deeper, more profound. Maybe he was just trying to survive. As the hours passed, Daniel began to talk more. He didn't say where he was from, why he'd gone on a solo walk, or who he belonged to. But his eyes seemed to search for something in every story Emma told. As she spoke about her mother, the village, the difficulties of winter, Daniel listened quietly. Sometimes he would part his lips, but then he would stop talking. In the afternoon, when the ambulance finally arrived, Emma was waiting by the door. The sound of the wheels with chains cut through the snow. 3 people rushed inside, and they began to give Daniel immediate care. As he was being carried out, Daniel tried to say something. When Emma leaned in, he whispered in his tired voice, "Thank you, Emma. Really, I'm so grateful. You saved my life." Emma couldn't respond. Her eyes filled with tears. The only thing running through her mind was, she might never see this man again, and she didn't know nearly anything about him. Just as the vehicle door closed, Daniel extended his head once more. His lips moved slightly. "One day, I'll pay you back for this." And with that, he disappeared from view. Emma stood at the door for a long time, not moving. It felt like the snow had started again, but she didn't notice. There was a void inside her, an unspoken wait for something she didn't understand. She didn't know yet, but the man who left her door that day wasn't just someone she had saved from death. He was also the one who would change the direction of her fate. Time moved slowly for Emma. Since Daniel's departure, the silence inside the house had deepened. Yet, he had been a stranger. He had stayed just one day, then left in an ambulance. No note, no sign. He had been like a fleeting guest, passing through. But the mark he left on Emma's heart was far more permanent than she had realized. Still, life continued as it always had. She went to the cafe in the mornings to clean, visited the market in the afternoons, and spent quiet evenings with her mother by the stove. Her life was simple, heavy, but familiar. Emma didn't expect much. Life hadn't offered her much, and she had learned not to ask for more. She never mentioned Daniel's name again. But sometimes, in the quiet of the night, she would wake up and remember the shadow he had left on the blanket. Or, when she heard a car engine in the distance while walking, her heart would inexplicably race. And then, one day, it only took a moment for her to realize that nothing would ever be the same again. It was late afternoon. Emma was walking slowly home, a few bags of food from the market hanging on her arm. The air was clear, but chilly. The March sun was shining in the sky. The ground hadn't fully thawed, and she was trudging through the mud with every step. Then, she heard it, the sound of heavy engines. Not one, but 2 vehicles. That powerful hum coming from the city. The unusual sound breaking the quiet of the village road. When Emma looked up, she saw 2 large black vehicles. Bright, dark-tinted, city cars powerful. The villagers had gathered outside. Children were shouting joyfully, running after them, while the elders shielded their eyes with their hands, staring. But Emma's inner voice had already figured out why these vehicles had arrived, and who they were here for. The vehicles didn't stop at the village square. They didn't stop in front of any other house. Instead, they silently came to a stop in front of Emma's home. When the doors opened, time seemed to slow. It was impossible not to recognize the man getting out of the back seat. It was Daniel. But this time, he wasn't the man lying in the snow, covered in blood, lost in the storm. He was strong, confident, and calm. He wore a dark, elegant coat, his hands in his pockets, with the same familiar softness in his eyes. Emma felt as though she were frozen in place. She struggled to breathe. Her heart felt like it was about to leap out of her chest. Daniel took a few steps, smiling at her without breaking eye contact. "Hello, Emma." Emma swallowed. She wanted to speak, but the words got caught in her throat. What are you doing here?" Daniel finished her sentence. "I came to tell you something. To thank you, and also to complete the missing part." As they entered the house, her mother was sitting on the couch. Daniel greeted her with a handshake, then sat across from Emma and began to speak calmly. "I didn't tell you who I was that day, because at that moment, I was just trying to survive. To be honest, I wasn't even sure if I wanted to survive." Emma was watching him. Her eyes were filled with tears. "I'm Daniel Morgan, the founder of Morgan Tech. Saying this has never been easy for me. Wealth, success. It may look good from the outside, but most of the time, it leaves an emptiness inside." He took a deep breath and lowered his head slightly. "That week, I was here with some friends for a hunting trip. I'm interested in hunting. Being out in nature, tracking. It's the only place I forget myself. But that day, I left my team behind. When the storm came, I was alone and lost my way. My backpack, my phone, everything was gone. I was truly alone. If I hadn't found you that night, I wouldn't be here right now." Tears started to roll down Emma's cheeks. She was silent, but her mind was a whirlwind. Daniel continued. "That night, when you sat by the stove and handed me water, I realized for the first time that someone was seeing me for who I really was, without any identity. Just as a person." He paused for a moment, then lowered his voice and added, "I never forgot you." Emma's eyes met his again. It felt like time had stopped. The silence in the room only amplified the beating of their hearts. Daniel took a piece of paper from his coat pocket. On it was an address, a hospital, and an invitation. "I've arranged a special hospital for your mother in the city. She'll receive the best treatment. I want you to stay with us in the city for a few days. Be our guests. Everything is ready." Emma couldn't respond. Her heart was in turmoil. She was both grateful and confused. She was scared, yet deep inside, excited. "Why are you doing this?" Daniel lowered his head, then answered softly, "Because a life debt can be repaid, but humanity has no price. You gave me a second chance, Emma. Now, I want to open a new door for you and your mother." Emma clasped her hands together. Her eyes were full of tears. She nodded slowly. "For my mother? Yes, I accept." Daniel smiled. That warm, familiar smile. "That's the right reason." Then he slowly approached her. He looked into her eyes. Quietly, but with all his heart, he whispered, "But I want you to know, I never forgot you." And in that moment, all of Emma's fears, all of her uncertainties, disappeared for an instant. Because sometimes, life changes with just one sentence. And this was that sentence. The city road felt like a lifetime to Emma. She had never gone this far before. In fact, it was rare for her to even leave the village. As she looked out of the window, the forest paths, mountain silhouettes, and everything familiar to her grew smaller, silently disappearing behind her. Her mother sat beside her, her hands tightly holding Emma's. The old woman didn't say a word during the entire journey. Her eyes were full, but she wasn't crying. It seemed like the weight she had carried for years had lightened just a little. When the car merged onto the highway, Emma saw the city signs for the first time. The buildings were rising higher. The roads were wider, the cars faster. People walked differently, more hurried, more distant. Emma felt like a stranger behind the glass. But amidst all the chaos, Daniel sat quietly in the back seat, occasionally turning to smile at them. He wasn't pushy, sensing Emma's unease. He neither spoke too much nor let the silence grow uncomfortable. Emma appreciated that. With Daniel, she felt a strange sense of peace. He was still, the man who had mumbled her name by the stove during the snowstorm. Just Daniel. It wasn't a hotel, it was a palace. The spacious marble corridors, the high ceilings, the pure white bed linens. Emma and her mother were staying in a special residence in the city center, arranged by Daniel. As Emma sat in the room, her hands empty without a suitcase, she felt like she had fallen into a scene from a foreign movie. She couldn't sleep that first night. She looked out the window. The lights never went out. In the distance, thousands of windows in the skyscrapers were glowing. She thought there was a life behind every light. But from her window, there was perhaps a quiet, unnoticed, but resilient life. The next morning, when Daniel came to pick them up, he wore a comfortable sweater. He smiled. "Are you ready for the hospital?" Emma nodded. Her mother linked her arm with hers. When they got into the car, Emma glanced at the mirror. Daniel's eyes were fixed on the road, but there was a slight tension between his brows. She wondered, "Is everything okay?" Daniel turned his head. Their eyes met. "Of course. I'm just hoping for good results for your mother. I've instructed them to do their best." Emma lowered her head. She wanted to thank him, but words didn't seem enough. She could feel it wasn't just help he was offering. He cared about them. The hospital was one of the most prestigious clinics in the city. Doctors bowed respectfully. Private rooms were prepared. As Emma sat at her mother's bedside, she thought in the silence of the room, "Is this real?" Daniel left the room a few times to speak with the doctors. Then he came back in, sitting beside Emma. "How's she doing?" "For now, she seems fine. Detailed tests will be done, but there's nothing to worry about." Emma looked away. She didn't want Daniel to see the tears slipping down her cheek. "Thank you." Daniel gently took her hand, just for a second. But in that second, the feeling rushing through Emma was so powerful it echoed throughout her body. Her heart began to beat with a rhythm she had long forgotten. She felt embarrassed. She blushed, but she didn't pull her hand away. Daniel spoke softly. "Emma, I've met many people in this world. Some I've worked with, some I've been friends with. But you, I place you in a different category. There's something different about you." Emma lowered her head, unable to stop her voice from trembling. "What's different about me?" Daniel smiled faintly. "Reality, sincerity, courage. There was a night when you didn't feel ashamed of me being who I truly am. Now, I want to truly get to know you. Really know you." Emma stayed silent, because for the first time, she felt like her heart was speaking. It wasn't gratitude. It was something else. Maybe an emotion she couldn't name, something spilling out from deep inside her. Daniel continued, "These few days aren't just for your mother. They're for you as well. Please give yourself time. Don't be afraid of what you see. This world doesn't have to swallow you. Maybe there's even a world that needs your touch." In that moment, a curtain lifted inside Emma. Her fears, her habits, the boundaries she had set for herself, all took a step back. And for the first time, she asked herself, "Do I deserve another life?" Daniel's eyes were still locked on hers. And in that gaze, a single sentence formed in Emma's heart. Maybe, yes. That night, Emma couldn't sleep in the hotel room. She looked out at the city, and she realized there was a vast chasm between the life Daniel had come from and the life she had. But perhaps that chasm was made only of fear. And in the early hours of the morning, with the stars still shining, she whispered to herself, "Maybe this time, I won't be afraid to fall." That morning, when Emma woke up on the third day she'd spent in the city, everything around her felt like the fragile remnants of a dream. The hotel room was quiet. Too quiet, its polished furniture, the softness of the white bed sheets, the vase of fresh lilies by the window. All of it felt distant, as if it belonged to someone else's life. It was warm, clean, comfortable, but not hers. Not yet. She sat up slowly, blinking at the sunlight pushing through the curtains, and tried to ground herself. And then she remembered her mother, just a few streets away, in a hospital room that smelled like lemon disinfectant and hope. For the first time in years, her mother was receiving real care. Daily medications, a clean bed, a specialist who actually listened. And every morning, Emma was there, holding her hand, brushing back her hair, watching the color return to her cheeks. A piece of her broken world was slowly, cautiously, being stitched back together. Emma was deeply grateful, truly, silently grateful. But somewhere deeper, beneath the gratitude and relief, there was something else growing inside her. A quieter, steadier feeling. Daniel. He hadn't left her side, not really. From the moment they arrived in the city, he had been there in small, quiet ways. He'd spoken with the doctors personally, made sure her mother had the best care, even helped Emma navigate the endless halls of the hospital without asking for thanks. And when words weren't enough or too much, he simply sat beside her. Solid, reassuring. He never pressured her, never expected anything in return, but he was always there. For Emma, this city was no longer just a blur of skyscrapers and noise. It had become the place where Daniel existed, where his quiet strength had carved out space for her pain, her fears, her healing. The day of her mother's first checkup arrived with a knot in Emma's stomach. She hadn't slept the night before, lying in the unfamiliar bed, staring at the ceiling, imagining worst-case scenarios. Her heart had been racing from the moment she opened her eyes. She kept thinking, what if it's not working? What if she's getting worse? By the time they reached the hospital, Her hands were cold and trembling. And when the doctor finally entered the room, smiling gently, Emma couldn't breathe. "She's responded very well to the initial treatment," he said. "Her body is stronger than we thought. The early intervention has made a significant difference." Emma's knees buckled. She sank to the floor beside her mother's bed, clutched her frail hands, and wept. "Did you hear that, Mom? You're going to be okay. You're going to get better." Her mother smiled, eyes wet with emotion. "My sweet girl, I can rest easy now. I know you won't be alone. This man, he didn't just save me. He saved you too." Emma held her mother's hands tightly, but her voice caught in her throat. The words her mother had spoken struck her like a whisper through her soul. Maybe it was true, but she still didn't know what to do with the feeling in her chest, the mix of fear, tenderness, and something else she hadn't dared to name. That evening, Daniel was waiting outside the hospital. He wore a navy coat, his hands tucked in his pockets. When he saw her, he smiled a soft, patient smile, the kind that didn't rush or expect. "How about a little walk?" Emma nodded. They began strolling down the quiet streets of the city. The world had slowed down around them. A light wind rustled through the trees. Street lamps stretched their light across the pavement like golden ribbons. In this part of the city, there were no loud cars, no rush. Just two people walking side by side. For a while, they didn't speak. And yet, the silence between them felt full like something sacred. Then Daniel stopped. He sat down on a bench beneath an old lamppost. Emma sat beside him, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "I heard the results," he said quietly. "I'm happy. I saw it in your mother's eyes today. The light, the life. She's getting stronger." Emma lowered her head, her voice barely above a whisper. "If it weren't for you, we'd still be in that cold village. She'd still be in pain. I don't know how to thank you, but it's not just that. It's everything. Being here, sitting beside me, not leaving when it got hard." Daniel looked at her, his expression calm but serious. "Emma, I didn't change your life. You reminded me of who I really am." She turned her head to him, confused but curious. "What do you mean?" Daniel's eyes lingered on the glowing skyline in the distance. Then he turned to her and looked into her eyes like there was nothing else in the world. "Before I met you, I thought I was living. I thought having everything meant being full. But I was hollow. Every day was a performance. Every word calculated, every step measured. I had the world's respect, and none of my own. But that night, when you helped me without asking for anything, it shook something loose inside me. And ever since, I've been finding pieces of myself I thought were lost. With you, I don't have to pretend. You reminded me that I'm not just a name, or a bank account, or a company. I'm a man who can feel, hope, love." Emma's breath caught in her chest. She didn't have an answer yet, but maybe she didn't need one right away, because something real had already begun to bloom between them, quiet, honest, and unshakably human. And that was enough. For now, I might be seen as the owner of a big company, a billionaire in the eyes of others. People look at me and think I have everything: success, power, control. But the truth is, inside, I'm often lost. I've been walking through life wearing 100 masks, playing roles, meeting expectations. And somewhere along the way, I forgot what it meant to just be human. Until I saw you. That night, in that snowstorm. You reached out to me without knowing anything. You didn't ask my name. You didn't care about what I owned or what I could offer you. None of that mattered to you. You helped me simply because I was another person in need. And in that moment, you gave me something I hadn't felt in years: genuine kindness. Emma's eyes filled with tears. Her lips parted slightly, but no words came out at first. She was overwhelmed not by what he said, but by the truth she saw in his eyes. "That night, I was just trying to save someone," she whispered. Daniel took a breath, steady and soft. "But you did more than that. You saved me. You saved me, Emma. Not the CEO, not the man behind the fame or the fortune. Just me. And now I want to say something. Something I've been holding back. Maybe for the first time in a very long time. I'm going to speak from the heart." Emma instinctively pressed her hand to her chest, as if trying to steady the emotions rising inside her. Daniel looked down for a second, then back into her eyes. "I love you, Emma. At first, I didn't recognize what this feeling was. I thought it would pass. Then I tried to deny it, tell myself it was nothing, that it couldn't be real. But now, I can't run from it. I don't want to. When I talk to you, when I'm beside you, it's like my heart finally rests. Like the noise fades, and I can breathe. In this city, with all its noise and chaos, I realize it needs your silence, your calm, your truth. I don't want a perfect life. I want a real one. With you. Tears slipped silently down Emma's cheeks, but they weren't tears of fear or doubt. They were warm, healing. For the first time in a long time, someone truly saw her and didn't look away. Daniel, I'm scared. Your world is so big. Mine feels so small. You've seen everything. I've just tried to get by, but despite everything, I never forgot you either. Daniel slowly stood up and gently took her hands in his. Under the soft yellow light of the street lamp, their eyes met and stayed there. So what are we waiting for? Emma's lips curled into a quiet smile. It was like a weight had fallen from her shoulders, a burden she had carried alone for years. Let's not wait anymore. That night, as the city whispered outside the hospital window, Emma sat by her mother's bedside and opened her old notebook. She wrote slowly, thoughtfully. Some people enter our lives like a storm, but when they leave behind a sky full of light. And when morning came, she stepped into a new life. From a stone house in a quiet village, to a city filled with movement and meaning. From a quiet, unsure girl, to a woman who could finally speak her truth. From years of loneliness, to a life where her heart no longer walked alone. Emma was no longer invisible, and Daniel was no longer incomplete, because two hearts had finally chosen the same path. And maybe this story isn't just about Emma and Daniel. Maybe it's about all of us. A reminder that sometimes the simple act of reaching out to a stranger can change everything. If you love real, life-inspired, heart-touching stories like this, don't forget to subscribe. Because sometimes a story isn't just a story. It's a mirror, a journey, a beginning. If this story touched your heart, if it reminded you that even in the darkest moments, kindness can light the way, then don't forget to subscribe. Because here, every story is more than just words. It's a reminder that hope still exists, that love finds us in the most unexpected places, and that sometimes a single moment can change everything. Subscribe now, and let these stories walk with you.